Janice Hexford, welcome to the Planning Commission meeting for Lake Stevens, Washington, May 21st, 2025. If you would all please join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you so much. Appreciate you all being here. Let's do a quick roll call. Commissioner Dewar. Commissioner Morton.
Here.
Commissioner Jennifer Davis.
Here.
And again, I'm Janice Hexford. We will give Commissioner Packard a few moments to join us. And if I could please have a motion to excuse Commissioners Connor Davis and Commissioner Matz, please.
Mhm.
So moved.
Second.
So that was moved by Jennifer Davis and second by Commissioner Morton. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? With that, we'll welcome Commissioner Packard to the meeting. Thank you so much. We have had our roll call and call to order. Can we move on to any guest business? Is there any guest business online?
No.
Hearing none, seeing none in the room, we'll move on to our action items. Action item number 4 is the approval of our minutes from our Planning Commission meeting on May 7th. Have all of the commissioners had a chance to review those meeting minutes? Were there any edits, additions, corrections? I guess that's the same as edits. Hearing none,
No.
hearing none, do I have a motion to approve?
I move to approve the meeting minutes from the last meeting.
Do I have a second?
I'll second it. Jennifer Davis.
Thank you. So Commissioner Morton approved and made the motion to approve, and Jennifer Davis seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain? Excellent. Moving right along. We have several discussion items this evening. We will turn the time over to Senior Planner David Leviton.
Thank you, Chair. And yeah, I was just going to note, we were going to propose moving one of the other items up in the agenda, the housing update or how, I can't remember how we have.
Update should go first in the
Okay.
agenda.
So it shall be. Then I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you so
Right.
much. Okay, I need to share. How can I do that through the new?
Did you log into the?
I'm logged into the meeting. Well, you didn't, must have not.
Actually, there's no minutes. I thought that they were in here.
No, they were. If you have to go like specific to the minutes.
It's not in that main packet. It was in the.
Oh.
It's
okay.
the one-off
Okay.
packet.
All right.
It's the secret spot where they kept the
All right.
minutes this time.
Yeah.
I know, I had to look too.
All right. Let me try.
I think we had a problem with that one last
We
time.
had-
I think I
And then you can just share your screen.
like to think that.
Well, you're not gonna talk.
Should I just
Oh, that just,
message?
So while we
send it to
are
you?
waiting for the package to come up, everybody is aware that we are moving to Monday meetings starting in June, correct? Okay, then you are now duly warned, and that should last through the summer, ending in September when school starts again. Correct.
I'm just gonna send it to you if you can.
Did you find them? Oh, no, you've been,
I can't fix it. But you're good. I broke it.
Again, as we're waiting for technology to catch up with us, is anyone else having a problem reading the agenda, the packet off of your wireless device? Has anyone tried to do that?
Not this week.
Okay. I am, but it might be user error on my part, so I will try it again next week. It zones it out. It pops it up and then it goes away
On a phone?
on a phone.
Oh, I haven't tried that.
It won't let me share it. No, 'cause it's open.
Chris, is this something that we could bring up individually if we've downloaded it?
It's not been sent out, so let's try that. But thank you for the offer and thank you for reminding everyone about the change in schedule. We were going to bring that up a little bit later. And while Dawn's doing this, I'll give you an announcement now. We are getting scheduled for Aquafest. And since we have so many land use topics on the queue this year, we'd really appreciate the participation of the Planning Commission. If you can volunteer for each of you for at least a shift or think about what that looks like, it's a great time to actually work with the public and get their feedback on what we're doing. We'll have all the white papers together and information, but any of you can volunteer would be great. And you just see me afterwards and I'll show you the time slots.
Okay, and it should be noted that Aquafest is the weekend after the 4th of July this year. It's not
That's
at the
true.
end of July as it
Yep.
normally is.
That's your screen sharing?
Okay. And now try. Well, I sent you, could you just,
While we're waiting for things to load, on the note of Aquafest, Christy Schmidt, planning manager, the committee was able to secure carnival rides this year, hence that's why it was moved up a couple weeks earlier. So that's good news for the community. Because it draws the larger attendance with the carnival rides.
okay, I apologize to everyone about the delay. Again, for the record, Russ Wright, Community Development Director for the City of Lake Stevens. One of the things I wanted to do tonight is just give you a general housing report. I've attended a couple of events lately from different groups. And since housing was the #1 priority for the Planning Commission as we set our work plan for the year, I just wanted to make sure that you're receiving some of that same sort of regional information and then trying to put it in a city context. And then Dave will obviously go into his presentation later and talk about some of the specific things that we're working on. You'll move ahead, please. Okay, so this slide just says what I just said. It's been a big priority, and you'll see some information that was provided, the growth monitoring report from Snohomish County Planning and Development Services, and the latest information that came out of the Alliance for Affordable Housing. Okay, so the growth monitoring report is something that the county does annually. It just tracks what all of the cities are doing as far as growth trends, how we are achieving the targets that we set through our comprehensive plan. And so just some of the statistics that are interesting on this slide, if you look back to 1940, Snohomish County population has grown by over 830% since 1940 up to a current or 2020 population, which is at the time of the census, to almost 830,000 people. And that number has obviously gone up since that point. So the population growth right now, and I guess this doesn't read well, but what it shows is the county population model and the actual growth is actually right on track. So we, as a county, we are achieving the goals that we set as far as our individual comprehensive plans. Across the county, you've seen an average growth rate just a little bit over 1%, which has actually declined a bit since the prior 5 years. And that's kind of a countywide. You'll see that locally for Lake Stevens as well. And then the population change has been about 39,000 people in that 2020 to 2024 timeframe. And what's interesting, at the countywide level, there are several what are called regional geographies. So just individual segments of the county, different types of cities. You have your high transit cities that are on bus lines, mass transit lines. You have your metro cities like our one and only Everett. And we are in the cities and towns classification. And so with the growth trends, the cities and towns are exceeding their growth targets. Okay, and then if you look at Lake Stevens specifically,
Can you
Lake-
full screen?
can you go to the full screen on that?
Oh.
Let's pull it back up, the slideshow.
Bottom.
Yep. Okay, then you'll have to advance it through. Okay, so looking at Lake Stevens specifically, again, that same time frame, 2020 to 2024, we've added just about 2,600 people to the city. And that's about 6% growth in that time range. And we need to add, to hit our growth targets, about another 7,300 people by 2044. You're familiar with that. And then this chart on the upper right, again, shows that trends that we're also following for cities and towns, that we are slightly above our growth projection at this point. And then you just see the sort of average change in housing in the lower quadrant. Okay, next slide.
Sorry, just to make sure I understand that.
Sure.
So in 4 years, we grew 2,500 people.
Correct.
So it should only take us 3 more of those rounds, 12 more years to hit that 7,300 at
That,
the current projection, at the current rate.
yeah, that is at the 1% growth rate. Yes, or 1.2, yeah.
And just to clarify, we did have a large annexation in 2021, but kind of they adjusted the boundaries and adjusted their projections to account for that. So it's not like that 2,500 is all of the annexed population. That
Sure.
doesn't reflect the annexation.
And the other thing that they measure is employment growth. And what was kind of interesting is a lot of people have been sort of asking, what is the impact from the COVID, from the pandemic? And so we do see that it did interrupt the job market in Snohomish County as well as throughout the area. If you use 2019 as kind of your marking point, we're just now starting to hit those same levels of job production that were prior to 2019.
Do you prefer that we hold questions till later?
No, go ahead.
I'm curious about the impact that remote work has on us meeting our goals. For example, my employer is headquartered in Seattle, but I work exclusively here. So do I count as someone like me count as someone who's employed in Lake Stevens?
You count as someone employed in the city where it is based.
No. Okay.
But what is interesting, and I don't have a slide on this, but I can share the presentation, the full information with you on the growth monitoring report. And they are starting to try and collect some statistics from work from home versus working in corporate offices. But you will see with that trend that it is also going down.
Mm.
So there was definitely the spike again during the same time frame, but now it's going the opposite direction. Okay, and then if you want to look at the 5 years, so the next topic, and this was one of the new topics we talked about with you going into the comprehensive plan, was now we're also tracking individual housing units, not just population or employment. And looking at the 5-year averages, you can say that single family has been about 40% of the market. And traditionally in Snohomish County, single family has been the predominant. In Lake Stevens, it's been as high as 80% of the market. You're starting to see things like accessory dwelling units. Again, over the 5-year average, they were about 1%. If you look in the last year, that's bumped up to probably 5% of the market. Duplexes have stayed pretty steady. Townhomes have actually seen a pretty good jump in the market. And what's really interesting is when you look at the number for apartments at about 43% of the market over the last 5 years, that's actually a really interesting shift in the market that, we've all been predicting for a long time. And it is consistent with the latest iterations of the Growth Management Act, really preferring that more intense, higher density housing. So you are starting to see that trend. And when we talk about Lake Stevens specifically, you will see that as well. So again, major shift in the housing with the greater increased production in apartments and townhomes and other types of attached housing versus single family housing. And then about 5 cities really have been the ones producing the most amount of housing over the last, say, 20 some years, including Lake Stevens. Okay, next slide. Okay, so if we go back and make a distinction here between Packer's question earlier and this number, the question earlier was about population, and this one is housing units. So we produced, going back to 1990, about 4,800 housing units. 2019 was probably our peak year for new houses. You'll all recall when you couldn't go down a block without seeing a big cat somewhere, and massive housing construction, mostly single family. We have seen it decline though every year since then, even into 2024. But what's really interesting, and again, this parallel we talked about with the county averages, we've already rebounded this year with new housing products with the 2 apartment complexes that are being built up at Soper Hill. And our single family starts, our number has rebounded last year from being somewhere around 60 new units to 200 and almost 40 new units midway through the year. So again, this year we'll actually see a big rebound and break some of the trends that we've seen for the last several years. And again, a lot of that will be because of attached housing products. Okay. And now, are there any questions just on sort of the growth targets and what those look like before I shift to talking about some housing trends and economics?
Is there any recognition by the county that the growth in population should in some way track with the growth in the urban growth area? Because it's noted that most of the population growth has been in the cities and towns, probably in the urban growth area. And home prices have gone up significantly, reflecting the restricted supply of land. So is there any, and then it's at the county level that they can add additional urban growth area, right? So is there any recognition whatsoever that they need to increase that to make up to help the population?
So long answer. As they go through these growth projections, they are looking at urban areas. That's all I've really focused on tonight. They also focus on growth in rural areas. And as the last iteration of the getting ready for the comp plans, and when we set our growth targets, they actually reduced the amount of capacity in rural areas. So those are outside of urban growth boundaries, and shifted some of those again back into urban growth areas. But as the county went through its comprehensive plan, because as I've shown you, those targets generally are consistent with the PSRC vision process, no, the county is not contemplating changing its urban growth boundaries. And there were only very small adjustments during this last cycle.
Quick question. So the slide that you just showed us had it through 2024, and you made the comment that we have met and or exceeded what we were needing to do at that point. What is everything that is proposed land use action? Where is that factoring in right now?
So I didn't say we've met what's been proposed. I've said we've exceeded our growth from the last few years, that we had seen a decline in our permit numbers and that 2025 is rebounding if we go back to the
Okay.
last
So the
slide.
240 though are already being built.
Correct.
And
And
where do
the-
all of the proposed projects fall?
And so a large portion of those, and thank you staff for getting me statistics at the last minute. 188 of those units are essentially up at the Soper Hill site. Then we have 47 single-family units in the queue and some ADUs, and what's in the hopper. And I might have Christy answer this, but we have 5 major plats under some part of construction right now. So towards the tail end of this year, we might see a bump in more single families, but definitely going into 2026, we'll see a lot of single family applications. Did you have more to add to that, Christy?
I think there's 6, there might be 7 that
Okay.
are coming down. Start later this year.
And a lot of those are in the south east quadrant of the city.
Some of them are small, there's a couple of them that are short flats, which are 9 lots and under, but the other ones are the more major flats. That's it.
And if I can just jump in, I would note, Russ had noted that the cities and towns have exceeded their growth targets and have kind of largely been, obviously they're smaller than Everett and Linwood and Bothell. But you know, they've been ahead of their allocated growth targets, and that's something that occurred in the last periodic update cycle as well. And, you know, even with Lake Stevens seeing a decline in permits the last few years because we haven't been allocated as much on a per capita basis as, say, Everett or some of the other central cities. Even with the decline, we're still on a prorated basis exceeding our 20-year growth targets. And as we start to see that uptick, you know, that delta between the growth projection and the real numbers will increase a little bit over the next few years. And so it shows that, you know, similar to the last few periodic update cycles, Lake Stevens has exceeded its growth targets. I think, you know, we had reached our 2035 growth target, like 80% of it by 2020 or 2021. And so that got reflected in updated growth targets for 2044, which were much higher, but still we're already exceeding kind of that projection line.
Yeah, which we did show the one slide, if that's the one you were referring to.
Yeah.
Where yes, we are above that projected line.
Okay.
Okay, so we can talk about some statistics a little bit. So the city of Lake Stevens participates in the Alliance for Affordable Housing. They are a subgroup of the Snohomish, or excuse me, the Housing Authority of Snohomish County, or HASCO for short. It's a consortium of cities, and they really have been involved at really monitoring affordability in the county. And through the Alliance for Affordable Housing, they do have a program manager who works with the different cities and compiles statistics and helps the county also with some of their statistics. They aren't necessarily an activist arm that they're producing anything. HASCO has that role itself, but AHA does not. It's really more just a data-driven and sort of reporting group, just trying to understand the trends of what's happening in the county. Next slide. So this slide is in here just to show you what the cost is of houses across Snohomish County. So the average home price in Snohomish County, or actually the median home price, was around 822,000 in 2024. If you compare that to Lake Stevens, with the average home price being a little bit behind that, 736. Again, that's an average, not a median. And then that declines a bit for townhomes. And Lake Stevens is in the middle of the range. If you go across the county for home prices, and countywide, we've seen 20% of all home ownership sales prices have exceeded $1 million. So again, we are seeing trends up again in the prices of homes. And there's some big unknowns right now with what's going to continue to happen with the interest rates, the national market, and some of the other political events that are happening. So the housing trends will be a big question mark, over the next few years, just with prices. Then we can turn to rental prices. Oh, apparently I didn't change my graphic out in this one. But we can just still talk about the rents. So the average rent countywide is around $2,100 per month. And we've seen, increases from above 2024, but it's still lower than 2023. So those rental prices do fluctuate with the market some. And at this point, Lake Stevens average rent is around 1,700.
Russ, a quick question on that. What is there a standard of what a rental unit is?
Usually most of these countywide statistics, they're based on an average family household size. So like three people essentially.
Okay, but rent for a single, 1-in-1 versus
Right.
renting a house. So how do they
Right.
normalize that?
So this would be sort of a peanut butter number, but I can get you better information if you want
Okay.
to see what those breakdowns look like.
Yeah, I'd be curious. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, and so then just looking at wages and what the affordability section of the market looks like, we can say that, the market is absorbing the rate of production. We've already talked about that a couple of times tonight. We see that the median household income, again, is sort of right around that 109, 110, and that's for an average family. We have the Lake Stevens median household income is a little higher than that, and that's going back to 2023 data. And then as you look at this chart on the right, it just sort of puts that in perspective then with a household size of 2 and what the income range is, say, for very low income and the type of assistance that's available. So again, just to sort of summarize, we've seen that rents are on the increase, coming back up from where they had a decline. Wages are a little bit stagnant, and there are other forces that are affecting prices right now. And then just sort of in summary, pretty much what I just said, prices are starting to rise again since, it cooled down in 2023. We still need to add about 160,000 units, 80,000 of those, for low income, the average median income for the county. Production is on the decline a little bit, and we don't know what's going to happen with the implementation of our new comprehensive plans and several of the new pieces of legislation coming out of Olympia over the last couple of years, whether that will increase or decrease housing supplies. So again, my intent tonight was just to really show you some regional perspective on this and reflect on, that as we talk about more housing targets throughout the rest of this year. Any additional sort of questions or comments?
Sorry, just one more question.
Sure.
At the regional level, where you were getting your information, are there any pushes or movements towards fostering kind of an ownership mentality rather than a rental mentality. I understand that, you know, we need to have housing at all levels
Mhm.
of and all sizes, but, you know, trying to get people with a stake in where they're living rather than, you know, paying the rent for it.
It's both. I mean, there's always a desire and a lot of conversation about, you know, home ownership versus rental, but they are two different markets for, you know, different demographics and the county and the cities. So yeah, there is definitely, I would say, a political push, you know, that people still sort of value that traditional thought of home ownership, but what's reflected in the market, there's a need for home ownership and for rental properties. And you will see at the state level where there's been light reforms of condominium law and lot splitting that do sort of give a preference for home ownership, but again, they're both still valid parts of the market.
Has there been any interest or movement towards introduction of like cooperative housing? I know it's more popular kind of on the East Coast. I haven't seen too much of it out here.
I can't answer that question specifically. I mean, you see it occasionally. Dave, do you have any insight on co-housing?
Yeah, I mean, I would say over the last 10 years, it's been kind of one of the buzzier terms, you know, that you see introduced, especially at the policy level. And I haven't seen it reflected in the market very much. And I don't know if that's a product of the housing types and still the preference for detached single family residential. And as we continue our shift to more multifamily, if there will be the opportunity to introduce that kind of co-op component as opposed to everything still being rental, you know, something more like, you know, New York City, hopefully without the prices. And so, but yeah, I haven't seen a major shift towards that.
Thanks.
And just one last thing I'll share with you all tonight. We just updated our demographics on our webpage. And so might help put some things in perspective. So I've asked Dawn if she can just pull that up really quickly. You may find that interesting, some of the newer statistics for the community. And if you can enlarge that, would be amazing. Or just send them the URL. So basically it shows, you know, the current population over 41,000, sort of talked about these increases. The median age in the city right now is about 35. 68% of our residents are under 45. That's just a huge number. We've already sort of talked about the median household income being around 118,000, 6,800 jobs in the community. Over almost 15,000 total housing units citywide. Our home ownership rate's about 75%. And the industry, the largest employer in the city remains the school district, and then government, and then a lot of people in STEM type employment. Obviously still getting a lot of people going towards Boeing. Go ahead and keep scrolling down. And just go to page 2. And then one thing that's new, we added some information on our education levels. So for people who have their bachelor's degrees or high school, so the percentage of residents 25 or older in this community who have their high school diploma, that exceeds the state average. And people with bachelor's degree, about 33% of the population have a bachelor's degree or higher. And then we've done some other information on here about our sales tax rate, our property tax rate, and where some of those monies go. So anyway, it's just a little snapshot of the city. It's not specific or really detailed, but there are other reference points on here if people want to dig in and really look at more advanced statistics for the community.
I would be happy to send out the link to that if you'd like.
That'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Before we wind this up, I'd be curious to know, and I don't know if there's a way to do this. Certainly, I don't think that there's a way that the city could do this, but with the cap on rental fees and the uncapping of property taxes. I'd be curious to see how many of the Lake Stevens rental properties are going to just be sold outright and people getting out of that market. I don't know how you capture that, but it's going to, there's a point where those two are not going to meet and people are going to choose not to rent any longer. And that will be unfortunate, but it is what has been created for us.
We can try to watch sales trends, but I can't promise anything, but I'll see if there's.
I'm wondering if we could do a benchmark now
Yeah.
and then maybe a benchmark, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Single family rentals are going to be a way of the past if this is not going to be corrected at some point.
Well, the new census will be kicking off sooner than later, at least getting prepared for it. And that would really be the big litmus test, but yeah, we'll see. If anecdotally, we can come up with any information.
Thank you. Anything else?
No, thank you.
All right, then let's move back to discussion item 1 and discussion item A, actually. And Senior Planner Leviton will be taking us through that.
All right, so good discussion on general housing topic. So I just wanted to talk tonight a little bit about something that we introduced a few months ago when we were going over some of the various housing legislation, and Russ is going to have some updates on some of the more recent housing legislation updates. But stepping back to 2021 with House Bill 1220. So House Bill 1220, if you'll remember, it has a lot of different components. We talked about it a lot in relation to the comprehensive plan update, specifically related to the way that the housing element needed to be updated and how housing elements needed to be structured and the type of analysis that needed to be done. Basically, it shifted and required cities to really be planning for the housing needs at all income levels and to basically equate those income levels with different housing unit types. And that was reflected in the city's need to do some rezoning concurrently with the 2024 periodic update to create additional opportunities for multifamily residential units, as well as for what's called permanent supportive housing and emergency housing. So there's a larger kind of general term for this end of the housing spectrum, which is called step housing. So that the S is for shelters and emergency shelters. So that's more temporary shelters to address immediate homelessness. It can be both inside and kind of more like temporary encampments. Transitional housing is also for addressing homelessness, but providing that transition from homelessness to permanent housing. Typically, there's about a 2-year cap on those transitional housing. They're not intended to be permanent in nature. The population that is served by this housing type is anticipated to change in the hope that is ultimately, whether you couple it with services or just provide that interim stability to get people back on their feet to allow them to get back. Housing, emergency housing as opposed to emergency shelter. It's kind of, there's a lot of overlap there, but that is more temporary indoor accommodations. And then permanent supportive housing, which is the P in STEP, we talked about a fair amount as part of the comprehensive plan. So that is permanent housing. It's not intended to be temporary in nature. It's permanent housing, especially for people with disabilities, people with a documented need for services to be integrated in with that housing. And so there were specific growth targets for both emergency housing and permanent supportive housing that the city was required to show adequate zone capacity for, which we did through our land capacity analysis last year. Originally, a lot of this work and a lot of this code work was the direction from the state was to have this done concurrently with the comprehensive plan. So by December 31st of 2024, kind of as the state looked at it, that it maybe didn't make sense to be requiring the development regulations at exactly the same time. They've pushed out that deadline to the end of 2025. So we're still coming up on that date, but we've obviously been working through the policy components of this, and now we need to actually get into developing our development regulations. So there are a couple main things. So basically the House Bill 1220 required local jurisdictions to allow, or I think the term is not prohibit, emergency housing in any zone where hotels are allowed. So if a hotel is allowed, you also need to allow emergency housing and emergency shelters. So when you look at our zoning map, that's generally the red and purple areas, which are red is commercial. Purple is kind of this area of the city. It's also kind of commercial / mixed use. It allows for a variety of things. The red and the purple generally corresponds with the city sub areas. So downtown, Lake Stevens Center, 20th Street, Southeast Corridor, that's where most of this zoning is found. Some of the components of House Bill 1220 related to emergency housing and shelters is that local jurisdictions may not impose overly restrictive regulations on religious organizations specifically. So things like safe parking, the utilization of say a church's parking lot to accommodate people that to camp or to potentially, have a safe space to essentially live in their cars. There are some regulations related to that. While there are some state mandates, there also is flexibility provided in 1220 to allow cities to limit things like occupancy, spacing, so basically buffers in between individual uses, and intensity of use, as long as they are related to public health and safety. And you can kind of demonstrate that nexus between the regulation and really the intent of the state legislation. They also can't basically prevent cities from reaching their growth targets. So you can't be so restrictive that it makes it impossible to reach your growth target. And then there's also both for emergency housing and shelters and also for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, basically not creating a bunch of regulations that treat unrelated persons within a household differently than, say, a family household. So there is some specific legislation that you can't say you can only have one, 2 or 3 unrelated persons in this type of housing. You need to basically treat it essentially the same as if it's a family household unit. So that was emergency housing. So the other part of this is transitional and permanent supportive housing. And so the required zones where that needs to be allowed is much more expansive. It's not only areas that allow hotels, it's also that allow either single family or a multifamily residential unit. So when you look at our map, it still includes the red and kind of the purple and maroon, but it also introduces all of the yellow, which is obviously the majority of the city. That's R4, R6, R812 is the orange. The orange around the lake is waterfront residential, the lighter shade of orange, and then the brown is multifamily residential. So when you look at this map, transitional and permanent supportive housing is the city is required to allow it pretty much everywhere except for public, semi-public, so parks, schools, and then the blue in the northeast portion of the city, which is our industrial area. Basically, every other area of the city, the thought is that this is kind of in between kind of the emergency housing and emergency shelters, which are, it makes sense to limit them in nature a little bit more as far as where they're required to be allowed. But it kind of is kind of that midpoint between a standard residential unit, and it really should be treated more as such as it should be treated more as a standard residential unit, say, than an emergency housing or an emergency shelter, which is very temporary in nature and should probably be focused more in areas with proximity to transit, specifically services, shopping, all of that. So it is going to be kind of a major change because it's basically similar to adult family homes, or it's to some of the other uses that are regulated by the RCW or the WAC. Basically needs to be treated essentially the same as other residential units. That being said, similar to the emergency housing and the emergency shelter, House Bill 1220, as it updated the Growth Management Act, does allow the cities to limit things like occupancy, spacing, and intensity of use, but again, really stresses that you establish that nexus between the regulation and the legislation and really the way that you're doing it, kind of the potential impacts and the regulations need to have a nexus between them.
David, if I may,
Yeah.
would this be, and I'm trying to think of the city that just went through this. But would this include the, rehab outpatient, sort of community, housing? I'm trying to think of the right word
Oh,
for the.
for the permanent supportive housing, like how does that with like?
Yeah, so does this zoning
it's-
include, you said adult adult homes, but would this also include anybody that wanted to have a facility for people in that middle space between a rehabilitation addiction center and being in the general public? There's a space in the middle of that. Does that fall into this?
Yeah, so those are generally covered. They're not considered permanent supportive housing per se. They're already allowed in a majority of the zones, depending on the scope and the scale of them. And I can get more information on that. But the permanent supportive housing is slightly different than, God, I don't know why I'm blanking on the.
Adult family.
Well, the adult family.
Adult family home is one, but then there's the
It's like.
transitional housing, a rehabilitation transition.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm blanking on the most common name for them. It's
Kind
well,
of
not
a
halfway.
halfway house.
It has like a proper name too,
Has a
like.
Treatment with it.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Those are covered already in the
Those-
municipal code.
Okay.
As types of medical facilities. So they are in the same sphere of influence, but I think what David is suggesting is they have some slightly different technical definitions, but that is part of what we need to untangle. And I know he and I have already had those
Okay.
conversations where these types of we'll say housing with custodians, custodial. type
Custodial housing,
versus the supportive housing.
right. So both for, and I'm trying to think of the city, but they had the conversation, it was running a dual issue. One was halfway house for addiction placement, sort of an interim placement while they are getting back to speed. And then the other was when people are released from our prison system and that transitional housing. And they were trying to come up with the rules and regs for both of those because they got hit at the exact same time. I believe it was, they were trying to come in under 1220.
Yeah, and so there is a specific definition of permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency housing, and it overlaps, but it doesn't specifically include those types of housing that you're talking about, largely because a lot of that is already covered by various state laws, and there's actually been all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, there's been case law specifically related to household makeup, and when you have these types of homes that do serve, whether it's substance abuse or kind of clean living facilities where people are living cooperatively, but they're not related. There's been all sorts of legislation and then also all sorts of, case law related to that. And so I'm happy to get into the specifics of it, but it's not necessarily covered by this map because it wouldn't be considered permanent supportive housing because again, with those, they're not intended to be permanent in nature. I'll have to check the definition of transitional because those are generally would more match that than permanent supportive housing, but I'm happy to circle back on that and report at a future
I think we
meeting.
can bring back a matrix.
Yeah.
Probably be the easiest with the type of housing, the definition, and what the statute is, because we'll be, as we talk through the step housing and step related housing, there are gonna be a lot of terms, so.
Okay.
For our own benefit, I think we're gonna need to.
And I don't want to beleaguer the point. It was
Yeah.
Nino that wound up in that sort of hole.
Yeah, and so we took kind of a first look at our existing code language. So with kind of in the main chapters that we typically deal with. So 1440, which is permissible uses, 1472, which is parking, a variety of different chapters. And so there's some, 1408, which is definition. So attachment one in your packet tonight is kind of the low hanging fruit, just we need to introduce definitions for all these four different types of step housing. We need to update our permissible uses table for both residential and commercial to show that these are permissible uses as required by state law. There are some other minor sections. But we also anticipate developing supplementary use regulations for step housing, similar to those that already exist for things like accessory dwelling units, short-term rentals, temporary encampments. So those are all found in chapter 1444. So the supplementary use regulations these are permitted uses. Well, that was weird.
Echo back.
You may need to turn off here. So yeah, we'll be doing that, but also updating. Basically, we wanted to check in with the Planning Commission before we get to developing this kind of new supplementary use section within chapter 1444. We wanted to show some examples of what other cities have been doing over the last few months and year before we really get into that work. And so attachment 2 in tonight's packet was kind of Commerce Guidance Department, Washington State Department of Commerce guidance and best practices. This is kind of above and beyond what was included within House Bill 1220. This is how they're recommending that cities implement it. They're looking, their recommendation is to keep step housing as an outright permitted use as opposed to encumbering it with a very extensive conditional use permit process. They do acknowledge that a lot of these types of housing would be best suited to be near services, jobs, transportation. One of the things that, and in the examples, attachments 3 through 5, we included 3 examples of cities. One that had a very, very prescriptive code and really went into great detail on what's called an operation plan, basically how this is going to function, how you're going to deal with safety, how you're going to deal with parking. And then there are cities that have opted to be kind of a more hands-off approach and just kind of default to some of the state requirements and not to impose a whole lot of local regulations above and beyond the kind of the bare minimum requirements at the state level. Some of the guidance from Commerce is also to factor in the reduced parking demand, so to not treat them exactly the same as other either single family or multifamily residential developments, because generally car ownership is lower if a lot of them are focused in proximity to transit. So providing a little bit more flexibility on the parking side of things. And then again, if you're going to be introducing spacing, occupancy, and intensity provisions, making sure to tie those, really have those based on public health and safety, really demonstrate that linkage between, yes, there are things we need to make sure that we're regulating, that we're addressing from a public health and safety component, but it is limited to what's needed to address and mitigate the potential impacts, as opposed to just introducing additional regulations and additional requirements maybe that don't exist for other types of housing. So we did include, you're not going to be able to read this. I can't even read it on that screen, but basically just wanted to show kind of, we included the cities of Edmonds, Redmond, and Linwood because there are a couple of the cities locally that have already adopted their step regulations. So going from one end of the extreme, Edmonds was kind of on the very liberal sides of things as far as not introducing a whole lot of new language. They do have a new section that deals with step housing. It includes definitions, permissible uses, the purpose of the chapter. It includes a general expectations section that addresses things like nuisance, criminal behavior, and evictions, but it doesn't have a separate land use application or fee required. It's basically just an outright permitted use. And it's treated generally the same as most other housing types. You then go to the very opposite end of the extreme, which was Redmond, which was attachment 4 in your packet. They also have that purpose, definition, and permissible use, but then they introduce a 1/2 mile buffer between any individual permanent supportive housing or transitional housing. Basically, you can't have them closer than 1/2 mile to one another. That kind of goes, when you look back at the Commerce guidance, they're not a big fan of, their guidance generally doesn't really recommend in introducing the buffer requirements, but if you're going to do it, keep it much smaller than that. They point to more like 500 to 800 feet. So this is obviously somewhere between 3 and 5 times as much as that. That was established in the Redmond Code for permanent supportive housing and transitional housing, but not for emergency housing or emergency shelters. There are limits on density and occupancy based they vary based on code, on the zoning code and on the zoning district. So in some instances, it's 50 of a maximum occupancy that can be bumped up to 100. In other places, it's generally built on based off of the building code and how many occupants you can safely accommodate. So there is a little bit of flexibility and difference in how they treat it depending on what zone of the city they're in. And then as far as the city of Redmond requires not just an operational agreement, but also a code of conduct, a safety and security plan, a community relations plan, and also a parking management plan, which seems like a lot of individual documents to require. And then there are slightly different requirements for emergency shelters. So that's, Edmonds at one end of the spectrum, Redmond at the other, and then Linwood kind of falls in the middle. So it does have it has a specific land use permit application for step housing with a relatively minor fee of $193. And then instead of the way, Redmond has all of these individual plans and documents that you need to prepare. Linwood, their approach is a little bit different. They are trying to get to the same general place as far as addressing things like safety and security and parking and just the general operation, the demand for this type of housing. But they've established that basically through a narrative that's a required narrative that's associated with the land use application, where you still need to touch on all these points, but you don't need to produce them as individual documents. It also is not subject to some of the same noticing requirements. So I would say it kind of threads the needle and kind of more is in line with kind of probably the midpoint of the commerce guidance. It doesn't completely eliminate the need for a land use review process. There is essentially like an operation plan light in that narrative that's associated with the required land use application, but it doesn't go to the same extreme, I would say, as Redmond, which is very kind of rigorous and prescriptive in the process and the application requirements that potential operators are required to submit. So just circling back on the existing City of Lake Stevens code within the supplementary use regulations chapter in chapter 1444. So as noted, we already do have these regulations for specific uses such as temporary encampments, which addresses things like the number of consecutive days that they can operate, that a religious organization needs to be the sponsor. We do currently require a site plan, a code of conduct, a neighborhood meeting, and then a lot of the similar components that the city of Redmond is requiring now for step housing. We currently for temporary encampments. This was a code that was developed and then we haven't utilized it yet. So I think there was a lot of concern that went into the development and making sure that we have the right balance and can address safety and security. And then we actually haven't seen it implemented. So kind of maybe keep that in mind as we're developing these. Are we going to create a situation? We do have a documented housing need over the next 20 years for things like transitional and emergency housing, for permanent supportive housing. So how can we really balance, legitimate safety and security concerns, parking impacts, transportation impacts, with the need to provide housing at that end of the housing spectrum within Lake Stevens, which we've just gone through the comprehensive plan to demonstrate that we don't have a current supply of, but there is a projected demand for this type of housing in the future. Kind of touching on accessory dwelling units, we do have that section that generally just complies with House Bill 1337. And then short-term rentals, which is probably the most recent one that's, I think 3 of the 5 of you that are currently here were on the commission when we went through that process a couple of years ago. And similarly, introduce some things such as separation of at least 150 feet, a citywide cap on the number of short-term rental permits, noting that it needs to be reviewed as a type, it's reviewed as a type 1 permit, but it did introduce additional requirements. Neighbors, if you want to operate a short-term rental. So trying to create that balance where you're letting people, utilize their private property while also respecting the rights and the concerns of neighbors as well. So trying to find that balance and that fine line between individual property rights and then also legitimate concerns related to safety and noise and health and all of that are obviously very important things of a livable community. So we would,
Sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
Go back, on the temporary encampments, a religious organization must be a sponsor.
Yeah, so the way that the code is written, it basically could be at a church, a synagogue, a mosque. Basically, it needed to be on land sponsored by and owned by a religious organization. And there's actually a cap of one. So even if we had had one, that would have hit our cap.
Just saying, why not like at the Grange in South Lake Stevens, or at, why can't it be at
The food.
the food bank, or I'm not trying to make it so we have a bunch of these. It seems odd that we're
That was really
linking
just
it to a religious organization.
that was the framework for sort of all cities. And this was maybe 10 years ago or something, that this was kind of a thing. And you had the temporary encampments and they just sort of roamed from one church facility to another across a couple of counties. And I can't remember why this was constructed to be exclusive to churches, but that was definitely the framework we were all working under. There are some pieces of this that we know we're going to have to get updated along with this, so we can revisit that question.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to revisit that.
I thought there was a liability issue that the church had to, take some responsibility for, and then butting up to existing neighborhoods. So if you think of the areas, and when this discussion came up, and it was a while ago, these encampments were going to areas that had, a fence, and then here's your house, and or here's a school. And so they were trying to make it so that they had some parenting in where they were going to be. But yeah, it's been a while since it's been discussed.
So yeah, just as we're kind of introducing this topic and wanted to get initial feedback from the Planning Commission, just to provide the framework for some of the potential code language that we'll be developing in advance of adoption later this year. Just wanted to get your feedback, initial thoughts on kind of appropriate level of regulations and prescriptive requirements. We've obviously shared examples of, a variety of different approaches. How do we balance public health and safety with our documented housing needs and the dignity of all current and future residents? What is the appropriate development review process? Sometimes it's outright permitted and doesn't require any sort of land use application. Should there be a type 1 process? Should there be any public notice required? Should those processes be different for something like permanent supportive housing, which is going to be a permanent use, versus something like, say, an emergency housing or an emergency shelter, which may be more temporary and more transitory in nature? And then, we've talked a lot about community engagement, and we touched a little bit about our long range work plan and wanting to start to share and engage the community on these topics. As residents of Lake Stevens, how, are there specific ways that we should be reaching out to the community on topics like this, which, to be perfectly candid, can be scary, and kind of the first reaction sometimes is fear. And when you don't have an understanding of really what's involved with these types of housing, how do we have kind of that constructive conversation and, so that we can really be doing an education campaign and really reaching out and getting, soliciting valid, community input and valid community concerns, and not just waiting until we get to the public hearing stage and having kind of everybody expressed their concerns at that point. You know, how can we solicit that input early and incorporate that into the code language? So just wanted to kind of have that kind of introduction and the conversation tonight. Happy for Russ or for Christy to weigh in
I'll probably
with
add a
any
couple more comments.
additional. Yeah.
So obviously, as Dave's talking about the education piece, you know, the community's heard this now for what, 3 years, where we've gone through our housing action plan. So we've had that very public conversation. We've gone through our comprehensive plan. So I think the need is pretty well documented. And as we went through the comprehensive plan last year, we assessed the appropriate areas, you know, for upzoning changes. So we know it's something we need to incorporate. Realistically speaking, is Lake Stevens the ideal market for a lot of these more transitional housing types? Probably not. I mean, that's not just Lake Stevens, that's lots of communities that just don't have the specific infrastructure, mental health facilities, hospitals, expanded transit. So, you know, those are real factors, but we also know there's an obligation to do that. And as we've had these initial conversations, at least at the staff level, and you also have to put this out there in this wider context of all these other housing bills and regulatory reform bills that have been passed that said, okay, you got to do this and you got to do it faster. So we're also thinking, okay, what does a streamlined process look like that still gives the appropriate amount of protections and notice to the community, meets this target need that we know we have to facilitate. So again, I think at our staff conversations, we're really thinking that even though it's a very different topic, the model we created for sort of the short-term rental, where it is a type 1 process, you have specific criteria. If you look at the temporary encampment section of the code, it provides very good ideas about parking. We know we have to manage parking. Again, like we did with short-term rentals, you have to have rules of conduct. And in both of those examples, there is an extra way to notice the public. We also did that when we did our mobile food vendors, where even though it's a type 1, there's still an opportunity to communicate with potentially affected neighbors. So I guess that's kind of where we're thinking, trying to find this balance between a streamlined permit, at least for some of them, I think as Dave has suggested, with the ones that are going to be more transitory, they might need a higher level of control for the startup. But for some of these, we're thinking it's a type 1. Again, something similar to short-term rentals where you have the code of conduct. We've assessed the parking and we go through sort of a matrix and make sure that they're compliant with those objective standards. And that's a fairly easy way to administer and protect the public health and safety. The next level up could be something more like a type 2 permit through an administrative conditional use permit. And again, if we think that the particular use, maybe the more transitory ones, are going to have a greater impact and there might be more a requirement for public notice, then, you know, there could be that other threshold. But going to quasi judicial or something like that in front of the hearing examiner for a conditional use permit, that doesn't seem, you know, based on the commerce guidance, based on the guidance from the state for streamlined applications, that doesn't seem like it's appropriate either, and is probably putting obstacles in the way of developing this low-end housing versus, you know, sort of the target or the obligation of the community to house people of all demographics. So anyway, those are just some of the thoughts. But again, David has presented you with some questions. We'd really love to hear your feedback and what additional information you need us to bring back to you. First of many discussions on this, but again, we'll be talking about lots of housing, and like we did last year with the comp plan, we want to give you digestible chunks before we sort of move on to the next code we'll be working on. So again, thoughts are.
Before I forget. I had a couple thoughts. One is I do think that it makes sense to approach the different component housing, STEP, to approach them differently, the way that you just described in terms of the permitting. That makes sense to me. And the other thought I had was that for me, the sort of the Linwood model makes sense to address. And like you said, we've already worked on similar ideas in the sense of the codes of conduct and parking, but to not make it so onerous that it's impossible. The Redmond, the idea of having the applicants produce separate documents for all of these seems pretty difficult. It's a barrier that would be pretty hard to overcome here. But my main thought I wanted to express has to do with messaging to the community. And I do think that for me, the primary message is this is sort of addressing this in some fashion is an obligation we have as good humans and good citizens for our fellow citizens. But I do think we can also approach it from the perspective of respecting our community in general. And I know that there's a lot of discussion in the community about how hard it is to see, and this would, I guess, pertain more to like the emergency shelter and transitional components, but there's a lot of talk in the community about how hard it is to see bigger cities, what they're dealing with. And I think that our community might respond to this in a positive way if we are not only emphasizing that we need to care about this issue because we're good people, but also because we care about the community in general, and that planning ahead will help not only the individuals who are in need, but also maintain our community in a more holistic way. I don't even know if I expressed that clearly,
well,
No,
but,
that's good
Well, that's
messaging.
great.
oh, and it's Commissioner Jennifer Davis. I know we're supposed to say who we are.
So I guess I'll just add my 2 cents. I appreciate kind of the desire of commerce to encourage the city to kind of adopt an anything goes kind of mentality. But we've also seen some of these step housing facilities in other communities that have brought real negative externalities to the local residents. So from my perspective, I think we need a kind of a Linwood approach at a minimum. And frankly, I'm moving more towards a Redmond approach where there are set requirements that they must meet in order to bring this to the community. Because once it's here, once it's here, and it becomes a code problem at that point. So just to treat this like any other sort of housing, I think is kind of denying some realities to the community that are out there. So I would lean towards more closer to a Redmond or a strong Linwood. And I think certainly messaging to the community is critical here. I think we would get an earful from them. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Dewar. Moving on, Commissioner Packard, Commissioner Morton.
I have a number of questions. So as we look through the packet, like on page 6 of 76, toward the bottom, you talk about having very detailed regulations for temporary encampments. But since its enactment, the city has not received any applications. The price of land is already likely to make sitting step housing difficult. So how prescriptive should the code be, right? I guess my concern is, yeah, kind of what Commissioner Dewar was saying is once it's here, it's here. So I guess I would caution against saying, well, it's cost prohibitive. It's not likely, so we don't need to worry about it. Just thinking, okay, you have some billionaire philanthropist who makes this his issue of, hey, providing housing. And so they buy some plat, they do this thing, and there's very little code to prescribe what that should look like, and they can do whatever they want. And we as a city can't restrict that, right? Because the code doesn't restrict it. We have to follow with what's allowed per the code, and we're stuck. So I'm not saying we need to kill ourselves being super prescriptive, but I also wouldn't just leave it wide open on the assumption that it won't happen. So that was less of a question. I was trying to figure out though, like on page 9, 10, et cetera, right? As it goes through the different zoning districts, business district, commercial district, central business district, right? We're adding step housing. Do we know what that looks like in reality? Like in a business district, we're saying we're allowing step housing in a business district. What? I'm just trying to think through practically. I mean, that just means in the middle of like what kind of neighborhood or area in our city and
Near transportation, near shopping.
so
Because these are generally people who don't have their own transportation.
I know. So in all practicality though, like someone's going to build next to
Or on top of.
or on top of,
It'd look more
Or-
like an apartment. It would definitely have more of an,
Or
we'll say an
convert.
industrial type look or converted space, but it wouldn't be residential looking per se. It's probably
Okay.
more clinical.
And just to clarify, so those specific pages are in chapter 1438, which is our sub-area regulations. So the way that our code works is that you have specific uses listed for the zoning districts within the sub-areas. And those supersede the permissible uses and the development standards in chapters 1440 and 1448 that apply citywide, where when there's a conflict or if you have a prescriptive, permissible use within your sub area that supersedes, chapter 1440. And so that's the reason why we have to kind of spell them out for each of those individual zoning districts within those sub area regulations. And it's a little bit repetitive there. It's just like, it's different between the BD and the CBD and the CD. So we have to list them. Any place where like accommodation services is listed. So hotels, we also need to allow for step housing. And so we need to make that clear within both 1438 and 1440 that those are permissible uses.
so are we allowed to, does it have to be accommodated in that whole region? Or can we carve out, say, a subset of a region for that type of thing? That way we can, again, I don't know what that looks like.
Unless
A
we,
little bit more
unless we had
prescriptive.
carve outs for hotels and for residential units, it basically needs to match,
Okay.
for hotels and for depending on if it's emergency housing or transitional and permanent supportive housing.
But that's where you could put the buffers in place. And again, we have examples with our food trucks. They have to have a separation. Our STRs, short-term rentals, they have to have a separation. Our cannabis users have to have a separation. And so that's how you would control that rather than carving out a small section.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think through like, yeah, the 20th Street corridor, right? 20th Street Southeast. Yeah, we have this grand vision for what that looks like and we start building things and then all of a sudden this step housing pops right in the middle of it. And then nobody else then wants to buy or develop near that because of the implications, right? So could you say, hey, we'll allow it, but it needs to be at the end of that region rather than in the, I don't know what that looks like. I just,
Probably not. That's.
I was just gonna point out, Christy Schmidt, planning manager, that keep in mind, just because I work with a lot of code enforcement, that the city does have other regulations that regulate uses just outright. We still have our noise ordinance. We still have parking within the right of way, disturbance of the peace. We have all these other things. So I think it's important as you think about what you want to regulate, you need to think about why you want to regulate it. Is it the quantity? Is it the noise? Is it the activity that it could result of? But just think of that. And I think that will help guide what you want to see for additional restrictions.
okay, one other question. So on page 44, I mean, it just says jurisdictions must demonstrate they have sufficient land capacity, right? So that's been said throughout. So then the question is, does that mean that a certain percentage, I'll say, of land has to permanently be set aside? Meaning, again, look at 20th Street corridor. If that just gets built out in that whole region, yeah, we have plans to build that whole thing out. Do we have to set aside a certain percent of that for step?
No.
Okay,
We don't know. So that was part of the exercise in the land capacity analysis is you don't need to guarantee that this is going to be built. You know, you don't need to show exactly where it's going to be built. You need to show overall in all of your zones that you have the capacity, especially for emergency housing. That's difficult to project. I mean, our land capacity analysis showed that we needed a couple hundred beds, and our growth target was for a couple hundred beds, and then our land capacity analysis said, well, we're required to allow it in all of these commercial zones, so we actually have capacity. If you were going to build all of it as emergency housing, we have capacity for thousands and thousands
Sure.
of beds, and that's all we had to show. We didn't have to get into any great detail and say this is where it's going to be built, or we're going to guarantee that it's going to be built. We just had to, if you have a city that doesn't have, if you have a residential enclave that has no commercial, and and they say, hey, we're just not going to allow it because we don't have any places that allow hotels, they would have to demonstrate, well, then how are you going to meet your mandate? So it's more geared towards cities like that, as opposed to us where we had adequate zone capacity. And especially once we did some of the rezones to multifamily residential down in the southeast and southwest parts of town, we had adequate capacity for the permanent supportive housing as well.
okay. I'm going to keep going. In that same paragraph, then, it says, it is also recommended jurisdictions resist addressing all community concerns and potential project impacts with their ordinances and regulations, right? So it's, what I read that as is, hey, you could go have a community open house. They're going to come back and say, these are all the things we're worried about. So this guide is saying, don't try and address all of that. Rather, defer to funder requirements and clear communication processes with housing and service providers. So one, what is a funder requirement? Who's a funder?
I think they're talking about on the lending side of to actually get it built. And, especially if they're eligible for any sort of tax credits or anything like that. And I would just say, to be perfectly frank, I mean, this is a guidance document and it's not
Sure.
part of the legislation for a
Understood.
reason. And so Commerce definitely has an advocacy role in this that, we don't necessarily have at the local level. And we're going to be able to be more reflective of the community than I would say,
Okay.
Olympia is. So.
But what they're inferring is if whoever the authority is that builds it, they know how to do this and they have the rules and it'll be okay. So I mean, that's sort of, I think, what you're worried about is.
Sounds dangerous.
And what we've heard that you need enough of a framework around it that it, protects the community and provides this opportunity. So.
Yeah, and I get that we can't address every community concern, but we should at least hear the general concerns and make sure we're cautious. Okay, page 45 of the packet is on reducing development barriers, right? So the code does not require that we reduce permitting fees or anything like that, right? It also says we can't put undue increase the burden, but it doesn't also require us to reduce the burden.
Correct.
So we would, as a community, we would only do that if we felt strongly about wanting to facilitate certain things, and then we could choose to subsidize things or reduce fees or accelerate permitting processes, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Yeah, no, and so on this one, I think it's, there is language, there's language in the actual legislation and then the Growth Management Act that you can't create, restrictions that are so cumbersome that it basically makes it impossible to develop this. So if you introduced a land use application process where the permit fee was $2.8 million to do any step housing project, I would say that wouldn't survive if somebody challenged it.
Sure.
But if you have, if you can develop and establish that nexus between your regulations and the land use process and any noticing requirements and show why you're doing it, and, you do that through your ordinance and you have all the whereases and you establish your legislative history, then yeah, that's perfectly fine. And Commerce may not want you to develop certain regulations, but if you go through a community engagement process and you engage your planning commission and your city council and you come up with a code that is, supported at both of those levels and has been kind of reviewed and you've received public comment from the community and ultimately it's adopted by city council ordinance, as long as it doesn't directly conflict with the state legislation, it meets both the spirit and the intent of the law, I would say.
Okay. So I'm going to kind of ask the commissioners for some comment or discussion here. So I guess I'll be transparent, right? When I see this topic, it scares me. It makes me nervous of what that looks like. Maybe it's because I haven't seen successful implementation. My guess is it's out there. Maybe I haven't seen it. So Commissioner Davis, you specifically, well, what I thought I heard you say was something to the effect of, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do. We need to take care of our constituents that are in tough circumstances, et cetera. So, which I morally, right, want to agree with, right? I want to help people. So the question is, do we think that we would, as a body, encourage reduction in fees or other benefits to accelerate this type of thing? Like, what would we say to city council? Or do we say, no, just treat it like anything else? Well, yeah, I'm trying to open that up to the body. What?
I think we should treat it like anything else, but both on the positive and the negative side, we shouldn't be restricting it anymore.
Agreed.
We should be incentivizing it. I don't think, we don't have, I don't think we should have one set of rules of behavior for people who live in one type of housing and another set of rules of behavior for people who live in another type of housing. That just seems completely unfair. So,
Commissioner Davis, I'm specifically looking at you because of your comment.
yeah, no, I
And
agree.
correct me if I misspoke or mischaracterized your comment.
No, I don't think you did. I think where I stand on it is, I don't think that I think we should be very mindful of not putting undue barriers to
Okay.
anybody that wants to come in. But like I said, I kind of appreciated the Linwood model where the concerns of the community are addressed. But maybe not in such a prescriptive way that it's difficult to actually implement something like this. But the reason I express that is I do think that, and this might be a messaging component too to the community. I don't see, there were several comments that were, once this is here, it's here, there's no going back, And we talked about the fact that we're a community that doesn't have comprehensive social services back when we talked about safe injection sites and, like on a lot of different topics. And we still are that in that position. So when I look at this, I don't think that we're going to be attracting hordes of people who are coming here to be here. We can't support it. I don't think people who are in need are going to think, oh, I want to cross the trestle and go to Lake Stevens. But I also don't think of it in terms of like, let's roll up the trestle and pull up the drawbridge because we want to maintain everything. We can't do that. We shouldn't do that. The way I view it is we're not preparing to repel anybody or attract anybody. What, in my mind, what we're doing is these are needs that we're preparing for ourselves. Like the community is here. The people that need this are already here. Unfortunately, in the next 10 years, there might be a lot more people who need support like this. Who knows what the economy is going to look like. So for me, I just worry, I don't want us to have like a bunker mentality in Lake Stevens. I feel like this is more about social safety net for the people that are already here, with reasonable standards around it. That will help us preserve the characteristics of Lake Stevens that we all appreciate and make us want to live here. But I do think that it sounds like such a middle grounder right now on this topic. I think I would agree with the way that you expressed it, Commissioner Morton, that it's not fair to impose different behavioral standards on anyone, but so I like the idea of just keeping this very neutral. Let's not impose anything that's going to make it difficult for this to happen, but also let's not incentivize it. Let's just, the way I like to think of it is what we're discussing here right now is how can we help take care of ourselves and the people that we know will be coming. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Largely, I mean, I'm in the same boat of, I appreciate the idea of a government safety net, right? There are circumstances and situations where people need help, short-term, long-term, et cetera. And we shouldn't suggest that there isn't any, but there's that balance in my mind of having too much and.
But crucial to remember too, that this is not an imposition on us as a community to build any of this. It's just that
Sure.
we, and especially in our role where we're just discussing on a macro level how we're going to implement the option if it were to arise. So,
Yeah.
I feel like social safety net really is very like New Deal language.
Sure.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay, thank you for the discussion. Anything on your?
There's nothing here now, but I think we need to be prepared. for Potential. Problems in the future. Sorry.
Anybody have their?
Okay, we'll try this one. We need to be prepared for potential new development of this nature in the future. And so recognizing that there have been some troubled developments elsewhere in the county, let's learn from that. Let's incorporate that into our plan so that when we do need to provide permits or whatever is necessary for one of these to come to town, we've addressed some of the potential issues ahead of the problem that may come. But no, I fully support Commissioner Davis in that we should not be creating artificially high barriers to this. We just need to be prepared, is all I'm saying.
Do you have any other comments? Because I am going to speak for myself in a moment, but Commissioner Morton also has some comments, but I wanted to finish up with you.
I
if
think I'm
you-
good for now. Thank you.
Okay, appreciate your inquisitiveness.
So when we think of each of these four categories, we tend to have a picture in our minds as to what it is. And I think many people may have a horror story about what it looks like. There's actually pictures in here. Look on page 17 of the packet, and there are examples of three of those four categories. There's the hub on 3rd and Walla Walla, co-located emergency shelter, healthcare and child care services. There's the Pad House in Whatcom County, which is emergency housing. And then there's a Gonzaga Family Haven in Spokane. I wouldn't mind having these in our city. In my opinion, I think we should follow the guidance provided by the state. I agree with all the best practices that they have on page 19, except for one thing. And I think we already talked about this a bit. All these, the bullet points on that page 19 are I agree with, except for provide land use and financial incentives to encourage more step production. I think we should treat it equally. I would agree with the Edmonds model that basically defines things, follows the guidance from the state, and allows everything to be a type 1. These housing types to be a type 1 application. And when I read through the Redmond regulations, I'm actually shocked at how onerous they are. They clearly do not want anything like it in their elite town. I mean, could you imagine if you wanted, say you were building a house in the city, and the city says, we need a copy of your house rules. We want to see what rules you're following in your house. We wouldn't even think of that. But when it comes to these other housing types, we want to know, like in Redmond, they want to know what are the house rules. And it's like, yeah, break. We're not in East Germany. So I think we should be respectful for the people who are not able to live in a single family home and who either are forced to or choose to live in other types of housing, and to give them respect. And I believe it's true that we will have more of that here. We'll have more of a need of that here
And if we don't accommodate for it, we'll just end up with more homeless on the street rather than in these types of houses.
Thank you. Any other comments before I wind up? Absolutely.
Just as a follow-on, so I saw these pictures. I appreciate the pictures. What I just don't know is, are those the promo pictures they took right when they were built, right? And what do they look like now, 10 years later? So I guess my question for the staff, right? You gave us some examples of code from other cities. Are we aware of, I'll call it successful, maybe that's subjective, but successful implementation of these types of things in other communities that we could highlight? Maybe that's part of the community engagement, right? We can say, hey, look, these are other examples. On the flip side, these are other less successful examples that we've seen in the community. This may be things we want to avoid trying to do.
We can do that.
Right? So that's partially for my own knowledge, but also for the community engagement so that they have a sense of, you know, what worked, what didn't work, and based on that, where we would maybe steer ourselves to go.
No, that's a great idea for the engagement. And I would say, as kind of we discussed as we were going through the periodic updates, and as these growth targets were established, I mean, when you look at the growth targets for emergency housing and permanent supportive housing and compare them to the existing supply, especially outside of Everett, I mean, it's gonna be, yeah, if we get to 10% of the allocated growth targets over the next 20 years, I would actually be, or at least over the next 10 years, I would be shocked, just because it's a very ambitious number. It's factoring in that there's almost nothing built now, and they're trying to accommodate not just for future needs, but for current needs. So you have all of these people that are paying more than 50% towards rent, or, you know, on the verge of homelessness. They're all lumped in and their existing need. And then you're trying to account for the fact that you have zero supply so far, especially outside of Everett, maybe a little bit in Marysville, Linwood, and Bothell. Yeah, no, I think that giving examples and, you know, where there have been places where it's worked and where there have been places where there have been valid concerns, and how that's been reflected in regulations within those cities, or if, you know, if they've changed course. I mean, you look at the state of Oregon over the last couple of years, and they've had to do a 180 on some of their policies because they tried it, you know, it came from a good place and it didn't necessarily work. So you need to find that balance. And so, you know, I think there are definitely some opportunities for us to provide that information to the Planning Commission and then to the public at large.
I will make this very brief. I align almost completely with Commissioner Dewar. I took some time to spend a minute on the websites of Redmond and Linwood. Edmonds just wants to be Seattle, and we know what has happened there. And Redmond more closely aligns, even though it's been categorized as elite here in our conversation, but it aligns more closely with our vision and with our demographics. I'm not saying I would go completely to the extent that they have, but I think it does something that hasn't been brought up here. By putting these regulations in place before it happens, it protects those of us who have already invested in this community. And I hear more and more that those of us that are here already are the ones that are taking on the responsibility to regulate what's going on around us. There are ordinances in place, but when there's a noise ordinance, I'm the one that needs to call. If I have a short-term rental next to me, I'm the one that needs to make that, raise my hand and say there's a problem. If there was an issue to happen with anything that came into the city, it's on the residents of the city to communicate that. And that's becoming burdensome to those of us who are paying attention and know that we don't have things in place to protect us from ourselves. So I will leave it at that, except to say we may want to go back to when the food bank was being discussed back in its infancy. I was part of those discussions. And for all of the reasons that we need regulation now, they were saying, you know, we want to have these great facilities and we want to have a health center and we want to have all of these things. And we don't have the infrastructure to do that. So the food bank had to create its own sort of entity and then scale it back to what reasonably we could do in the city. And in our case, in this discussion, I think we can go to a place where we are protecting our citizens from any kind of uncertainty of what might befall them from what we've seen in other cities around the state and beyond. Oregon's a great example of that. So if you wanted an answer, that's mine. And I appreciate all the comment this evening. You've seen the gamut of discussion and I hope that that helps you. Does it?
It does. Thank you very much. And yeah, as Russ had mentioned, we're gonna have several touches on this and we're gonna be soliciting your feedback and your guidance all along the way. So buckle up.
With that, moving on, planning director's report.
Okay, I've already mentioned one thing, which was the participation in Aquafest. It would be greatly appreciated. So when the community wants to talk about issues like step housing or city demographics, that you're educated and you can communicate directly with them. So again, let me know if you're interested in doing that. And I did just want to briefly share a matrix. Don put this together for me and I'm very appreciative of that. And it shows you the different housing legislation that was considered this last year, just to give you sort of a breadth and scope of that. Because I know that's been something we've continued to discuss. So let me pull that open. And I think that speaks a little bit to some of your comments as well, Commissioner Packard, from the last meeting of what are we looking at for some different bills. So Dawn says I should be able to share now and I still can't share. So will you pull it up again? It's that is okay. But what I would say, to start the conversation, there were 18 new housing or land use bills that passed out of the 2025 legislature. So those are things we're going to have to look at, each and every one of those, and see how they work into our current work program or if they become new items for future work programs. And one of the things we've done is also look at what is mandatory and what is not. And so again, that would really reflect on how those are added into our work programs. And timing wise, there's some of them that we're already working on related issues, so we'll fold them into things we're doing. The suggestion about the pre-approved architect, I did look at that. And that bill has been scaled back. At one point, it was really just to have pre-certification for architects globally. And now it's tied to architects for accessory dwelling units. There are other competing things that cities are doing too, where they're getting pre-approved ADU plans. So there are a couple of avenues to streamline that, and we're looking at those options. I won't spend a ton of time going over all of these, but just again, really the big thing is there are 18 new bills, housing and land use bills, and we can send this to you if you want to look at those. Everything from the RIT increase that we've heard about, parking requirements, to new ways to do subdivisions, like we're discussing how we have to accommodate different types of housing in different districts. We now have to accommodate childcare in single-family residential districts as an outright use. Condominium reform, which goes to how are we looking at new home ownership, mixed-use development as it relates to transit-oriented development, mobile home communities, change of use permits, that those need to be simplified, and what can go through that self-certification. And that's what you talked about, Commissioner Packard, for ADUs. historic preservation, new middle housing authorization, foreclosure legislation, and co-sheltering, which actually speaks to the question Commissioner Dewar had earlier. So whole slew of things. We need to evaluate these, and we will keep you informed of what we try to look at now, if it fits into the parameters of our current work program, or if we push those out into next year.
I'd really appreciate you offered to send it out. That'd be great.
We can do that. And that's really all I had to share with the group tonight. Happy to take on any questions that I may be able to answer.
We didn't have commissioner reports on the agenda, but I'll open that up for anybody. Commissioner Dewar, commissioner reports?
None tonight.
Commissioner Packard,
Nothing for me.
Commissioner Morton,
None for me?
Commissioner Jennifer Davis.
I just want to say, I really appreciate our current roster. We've had such good, productive conversations on this iteration of the planning commission. So it's not really a commissioner report other than a comment. I appreciate it.
We have the full spectrum.
You just always end things so positively, and I will end it positively by saying our next meeting is on a Monday, June 2nd. So if everybody could shift thought, and if we could let the two commissioners that are absent this evening know that in red so that they could be prepared for that shift. Thank you so much. With that, if there's nothing else, I will turn the time over to you to say who would like to adjourn
I'll move to adjourn.
and who would like to second that.
I will second that.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Dewar, Commissioner Packard, all in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.